So, women feature prominently in the Gospels and Book of Acts in the New Testament as supporters of Jesus's ministry. The most famous of these is Mary Magdalene, who I'm sure you'll have heard of. Hello, Lion of Christ. Right, most likely an upper class woman of means instead of the prostitute label still wrongly attached to her. But there's also Mary and Martha, who, as any Christians watching will know, should know, are the sisters of Lazarus. And I mentioned them yesterday in reference to when we were talking about Blandina and can't remember Perpetua, and the fact that Christ allowed one of them to sit at his feet whilst he was a rabbi, which was out of like the societal norms. I'm going to stop adding side notes. Never going to happen, but here we go. And many others who are referenced warmly in the epistles, even when women in general are referenced as kind of second class. So the first people recorded as seeing the resurrected Christ were women, as hopefully everybody already knows, and women are integral to the first Christian community as depicted in the book of Acts. Christ himself has nothing to say about equality because I think it's a presumption of his that men and women are equally bad, basically. So there's no superiority in as far as gender or sexes rather. He seems throughout the Gospels, it says here, to take as self-evident that there's nothing inherently superior in either. And St. Paul, or Paul as I call him, those and other writers and Paul basically introduced the sort of hierarchical, as it were. I mean, Christ did, reference to husband being the head of the wife and Christ being the head of the husband, I don't believe is saying that there's any superiority at all. And I can come to that either later or another time. So, basically Eve was linked to the fall of man directly. And I think therein crept in, apart from the societies around the Israelites and, everybody else of that time, women weren't exactly top of the pecking order. I'm going to stop waffling any time now. Right, so prober. Here we go. Right, hold on. Right, stop. Eve, as Paul writes, was deceived and then tempted Adam to sin. Left to his own devices, I read here, the implication is that Adam would have remained happily in the garden, and so would all his and Eve's descendants. Women, therefore, are not to be trusted, apparently, and could not hold authority over men and should learn from men in silence. Lest they tempt Adam's descendants further. I mean, further from fallen, I don't know, but 1 Timothy 2:11-14, if anyone wants to get on that bandwagon. Even so, Paul himself seems to echo Christ's own view of the equality of the sexes when he writes, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, i.e. slave or free man. There is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ. Sorry, it cut out. The many other passages from the New Testament supporting male superiority, I'm afraid, were and still are quoted far more often than the line from Galatians that I just read. And women are still denied leadership positions in a number of Christian denominations and sects. I actually have personal views of that, but we won't go into that. So this was not always so. And there were many women in the early church who held positions of authority, established religious orders, and wrote influential theological works prior to the suppression, often, of those works. So anyone with even a cursory knowledge of Christianity has heard the term church fathers, but much, much, much less so, because it sounds kind of made up, is church mothers. And yet in the early days of Christianity, women were at the forefront of the religion. And I know that in derogatory remarks, like they were accused of being a religion just for women and children and basically idiots. So Roman women were the first to take Christianity seriously, and there are many stories preserved in the writings of the church fathers and in the tales of the martyrs, which is what we started on yesterday, of strong women converting their households to the new faith. Some of these early church mothers embraced Christianity so completely that they gave away whatever they had, often substantial sums of money, large estates, to help the poor, the sick, and the needy in compliance with Jesus' directive that inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And that's in Matthew 25:40. It's not feminism. I'm not a feminist, but thanks for the comment. Okay. Service to others, especially to those in need, was service to Christ himself. And a number of these women came to be known as desert mothers, founders of monastic orders in the deserts of Egypt, Syria, Persia, and Asia Minor, known as Ummas or mothers. They were the female counterpart to the better known Abbas, i.e. fathers, such as, I read here, Antony the Great, also known as Saint Anthony of Egypt, 251 to 356 CE, who was credited with establishing Christian monasticism. Other women were famous writers who blended pre-Christian literature, i.e., I'm guessing Judeo, like Jewish literature, the Bible, and philosophy with biblical efforts, while also supporting men whose contributions today are more well known. So any student of the Bible knows that St. Jerome, and his dates are 347 to 420 CE, translated the work from Hebrew and Greek to Latin, creating the Vulgate translation, which would be used by the church for well over 1,000 years. Few people, however, know that the idea for that translation came from a woman named Parler, who not only inspired the work, but proofread and edited it for publication. So women's role, therefore, in the church remained more or less the same, even after Christianity was elevated by Constantine the Great, between 272 and 337 was his life, in 313 CE through his Edict of Milan, which proclaimed tolerance for the faith. So as many of you hopefully will know, Christianity is has a long history of being persecuted. It's not only today in Nigeria and Pakistan and all of those places. It was the first couple of centuries after its inception, as it were. It was a death sentence. So Constantine called the council at his villa at Nicaea to standardize Christian belief and practice. I read here that's not quite accurate. The most important issues were like prophethood. I don't agree with this. It says there were many other aspects of Christianity which were not uniform at the time, as we know, because Paul writes separate instructions to separate churches, and they had different poor behaviors that were going on. And so there were many different ways of practicing the central religious concept of one true God redeeming the world. And there's a lovely picture of Nicaea, which I think I'll put a link to. Okay, so whilst this standardizing process was going on, or whilst they were getting their acts together, as it were, in Acts as well, Constantine also wanted religious practice to reflect some uniformity, and Pope Clement I agreed that only men could serve as priests or hold authority in the church because Christ had chosen only males as his apostles. But the disciples, as we know, were many. The ecclesiastical writer Eusebius, 263 to 339 CE, records that the council, following Clement's lead and most likely influenced by Paul's admonitions on female inferiority, that over men. And by the time of the Council of Nicaea, however, many women had already proven themselves capable and inspiring religious leaders, and many more would prove so going forward. So these are now a list of 10 women who should be famous, but they're not. So, or some of them maybe. Right, the 10 women listed here are chosen from either end of the spectrum. So some of the names will be familiar to you, and some will be never heard of. So they're a very small sample of many women who contributed to the development of early Christianity, and we can go on to look at it in more detail another time. So this is just a list now. Thecla, the apostle, Perpetua, the martyr. I'm so sorry for my pronunciation before it happens. Amma Syncletica of Alexandria, Saint Marcella, Macrina the Younger, Proba, Saint Paula, Melania the Elder, Eudocia, and Egeria. She's pretty late, actually, Egeria, not only in the list. Okay, so Thecla, 1st century, so the same century that Christ was born, died, resurrected, and ascended in, is known for the apocryphal work, The Acts of Paul and Thecla, which narrates her conversion to Christianity by St. Paul and her subsequent travels with him. divine rescue from various persecutions and death, and career as a healer, preacher, and inspiring religious leader. Thekla's story has been regularly dismissed in the past as Christian fiction, but modern scholars believe that though there is no doubt some exaggeration of events, the account is based on an actual woman. In his epistles, Paul regularly mentions women who have helped him, and Thekla's story is not so very different from many others, save for the repeated miraculous rescues from death. One aspect of her story, known to be true of women of her time, is her vow of chastity, which she kept from her conversion up until the end of her life. Women choosing a chaste life, even if they were married, was a dramatic statement of individuality in claiming rights over their own bodies and, by extension, over the direction of their lives. And we read yesterday about Perpetua, who gave up her position as mother and daughter. So Perpetua, again from yesterday, 181 to 203. She's famous as an early Christian martyr who scholar I.M. Plant notes that in nearly every case, stories of Christian martyrs have been fictionalized and or are fictional, but the martyrdom of Perpetua, however, is generally taken to be exceptional to this rule. A citizen of Carthage, Perpetua was arrested during a persecution of Christians under the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus, sounds like a Harry Potter character, who lived in 202 to, who was born in 202 to 203 CE, because I was thinking that's a short life. She was 22 at the time and nursing her newborn when she was taken to prison. Her father and renounced her faith, but she refused and was executed along with her servant. Based on details of the original narrative concerning motherhood, scholars believe that her diaries basically were written by a woman, i.e. her. The early part by her, and obviously the account of the death would have been added, I guess, by somebody else. So Amma Syncletica of Alexandria, she's 3rd century, at least her birth is in 270, and she died circa 350. And she's one of the best known desert mothers, and I'm embarrassed to say I've never heard of her, and an early founder of the monastic tradition. Syncletica was the daughter of wealthy parents in Alexandria, Egypt, whose beauty attracted many suitors. She refused them all, however, due to her devotion to Christ. And after her parents' death, she cut her hair, gave her inheritance to the poor, and left the city with her younger sister, who was blind, to live a life of chastity, poverty, and solitude near the crypt of a relative. And in solitude, she is said to have wrestled with demons who tried to convince her to resume her previous life of wealth and pleasure, but she remained faithful. Having attained the enlightenment and closeness to God that she sought, she consented to teach others who sought her out and provided guidelines for this early monastic order of women. These rules, recorded by a biographer, possibly Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, would later influence European monasticism. Hi, Peter. Right, Saint Marcella was a wealthy Roman Christian woman who, after her husband's death, devoted herself to her faith through a life of chastity. Again, it's pretty popular at the time, and well, it also is now in convents, and fasting and mortification of the flesh. She was a friend of the future Saint Paula and correspondent with Saint Jerome. Marcella, formerly one of the wealthiest women in the city, gave away or sold her worldly goods, including all of her clothes. I'm sure she wasn't walking around naked, by the way, jewellery and expensive cosmetics, to benefit the poor and live free of possessions in communion with Christ. Like many early Christian women, she reclaimed her identity through chastity, refusing to remarry, even though the law dictated that she should, and dedicated herself to her improvised monastic order, which would inspire other women to follow her lead. She died in the Visigoth sack of Rome in 410 CE. Okay, so now we're on to Macrina the Younger, who, I don't know if she had an older sister, anyway, 330 to 379 CE. She was a Christian ascetic whose devotion to God inspired the work and life of her far more famous younger brothers, Saint Basil the Great and Saint Gregory of Nyssa. And they were both born in, 329 and 335, respectively. Macrina, like many of the others in this list, was born to wealthy parents in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and arranged to marry well. When her fiancé died, She refused to marry anybody else and chose a life of chastity and prayer, claiming that Christ was her bridegroom and she needed no other. So that's reminiscent of today's convent practice. Macrina practiced a rigid asceticism and devoted herself to the education of others, especially her younger brothers, who obviously went on to claim a little bit more fame than she. And after her father's death, she and her mother moved to an estate on the river Iris in Pontus, where she established a Christian community devoted to perfecting their relationship with God, and was frequently consulted by pilgrims who came to seek her counsel. So not like a second-class citizen, just someone, sweeping up at the end of the service. Prober, 322 to 370, holds the distinction as the first female Christian writer solidly attested by documentation. She is known for the genre of literary work called a cento or patchwork, in which an author used lines from established poetic works woven with their own to create a completely new work of art. In the present day, this would be sampling. A Roman family, and was most likely raised in Roman pagan tradition before converting to Christianity some time before embarking on her literary career. She combined the poetry of Virgil with biblical themes to emphasize the eternal and heroic aspects of Christianity. Her works were later used in Roman classrooms to teach upper-class children, as they subtly combined the pagan history of the past with Christian ideals. And now we're on to St. Paula. 347 to 404 CE. Paula was the close associate of St. Jerome, who encouraged him to translate the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, and thereby creating the Vulgate translation, which was in use for 1500 years as the authoritative scripture of Christianity. So pretty big contribution. Paula was another wealthy Roman aristocrat who, after the death of her husband, was drawn to the monastic community of women established by Marcella on the Aventine Hill. She became acquainted with St. Jerome through Marcella and travelled widely with him, so not a weak and feeble woman, it seems, establishing a religious centre in Bethlehem and practising strict asceticism, including abstinence. She helped Jerome translate the Bible, proofread his work, and edited it for publication. When she died, her passing was deeply mourned by the Christian community, and she was sainted, it says, within a year. I think that should say canonized, but I don't know. Okay, and on we go. Melania, not Trump. This is Melania the Elder, quite a bit older than the former First Lady, because she's born in 350 to 410 CE, and she was a desert mother honoured for her devotion to God and support of Christian orders. She was a member of one of the wealthiest families in Roman Hispania, who moved with her proconsul husband and family back to Rome, only to watch all but one son die of the plague. That's a shame. After losing her family, she converted to Christianity and renounced the world, travelling to Egypt to live in a monastery. Unlike other Christian converts, Melania did not give away her worldly goods and used her substantial wealth to support Christian communities and initiatives. Yay! When the monks of her order were exiled to Palestine, she went with them and supported them until they could return. She founded 2 monastic orders in Jerusalem, and devotion to solitary prayer. Eudocia, 400 to 460, was one of the most prolific writers of her time, who created numerous works on Christian themes, which, like Prober's work, drew on pre-Christian literature. She was born in Athens and named Athenaeus before converting to Christianity around the age of 20 and taking the name Aelia Eudocia following her baptism. Her works were quite popular and ranged from a cento drawing on Homer to poetry about her husband's life and military victories to saints' lives and church history. She is probably best known for her work, The Martyrdom, I'll get that right, The Martyrdom of Saint Cyprian, which tells the story of the chaste Christian Justa, the attempts by the pagan sage Cyprian to seduce her, his conversion to Christianity, and martyrdom for his faith. So he just got the hat trick, it seems. And then Egeria. So this is last in the list. And her work is available. Her original, well, not original, her transcribed writings are available, as I think most of the other things referenced. So she's also known as Etheria, and she's circa the 380s, and that decade is when she was born. She was a Christian traveller and writer, known only from her work Itinerarium, also known as the Itinerarium Egerii, or Travels of Egeria. And based on the text, which is pretty interesting because it describes the world as it was, apart from her, like, the things she assumed everybody knew. Apart from that, it's a pretty decent snapshot. And because she was traveling, obviously, she described things that she saw. She was a woman of the upper class who went on pilgrimage to significant sites mentioned in the Bible. And she traveled through the regions of modern-day Turkey, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and back to the region of Anatolia. So not a weekend away, in other words. Her work was popular enough to be copied, and is recognised in the modern day as completely unique for its time, as it is a deeply personal account of Egeria's travels, whilst also providing insight into the condition of the sites she visited, travel at the time, and since it's written in Latin. The contributions of these women were recognised by their male contemporaries, who included accounts of their lives in their works on male saints. Amma Syncletica was so highly regarded she was given her own biography, and St. Jerome praised Paula in his works. The works of Proba and Eudocia seem to have been widely read, judging from copies, and even though Egeria's work was not discovered until the 19th century, it was recognised then as appearing in excerpt forms in other works from shortly after her time. So, well known. Our lesser known is debated by various scholars. And the answer, it says here, depends often on the political, religious, or gender values of the writer who is making the claim. And that's not really a spoiler alert. In almost every case, the arguments in these debates say far more about the modern day writer than they do the subject at hand. However, I'm told, scholar Laura Swan sums up the situation succinctly by writing, "Women's history has often been relegated to the shadows, felt but not seen. Many of our church fathers became prominent because of women. Many of these fathers were educated and supported by women, and some are even credited with founding movements that were actually begun by the women in their lives. So as the church developed from its legitimization by Constantine through the Middle Ages, women lost more and more ground in equal rights," I read. "The medieval church considered women dangerous temptresses, to be avoided by any pious man, stained by the original sin of duplicitous Eve." Sorry, I am being serious. "And even their association with the Virgin Mary could not fully redeem their nature." Wow. Sorry. "The most probable cause for the exclusion of women of great merit from the history of the church is simply that they did not fit the church's narrative of devout and pious men, as opposed to sinful and tempting women. And when faced with the choice of changing the narrative, i.e. going against the hierarchy, or changing history, basically the relaying of that history was quietly shoved to one side." Quite handily, at the bottom, there's a bibliography of everything that I just quoted, and different, translations and stuff. So that's the end of that. I should have maybe broken them up into like smaller groups, but the overriding image that I want you to go away with is that women were foundational. They were they had initiative. They were not they were not only wives, mothers, sisters, children. They were church leaders. They were presbyteresses. They were pilgrims. They were, they were all the things I mentioned. They were saints. They were fundamental or causative in the Latin Vulgate, which, was used everywhere, basically, for, over 1,000 years. And not just sitting indoors baking cakes and putting the tea on.